Hello everybody, my name is Daniel Fernandez Pico. I am a part-time lecturer of the University of Alicante and a member of the research group TALIS, Transhistorical Anglophone Literary Studies. And today I'm going to speak about everyday menace, community and psychological terror in Shirley Jackson's short fiction. I'm going to start with a brief introduction, then I will give you an analysis of two of Jackson's short stories, The Summer People, published in 1949, and The Possibility of Evil, published in 1965. Finally, I will draw some of the conclusions that I have reached, and I will give you some of the references that I've used in order to perform this presentation. Psychological terror occupies a central space in Jackson's short fiction, whose narratives constantly show that fear does not require of the supernatural to be effective. On the contrary, Jackson places terror in the ordinary life, and she does so through social rituals, domestic routines, and in an apparent benevolent community where violence is exercised in a quiet, almost invisible manner. Her stories baffle readers through the gradual erosion of certainty as the protagonists come to the realization that safety, moral authority, and even identity depend on brittle systems of communal recognition. Within this context, the Summer People and the Possibility of Evil stand out as examples of psychological terror stemming from everyday social structures. Critical approaches to Jackson's work have highlighted her ability to expose the darkness underlying American domestic life. Judy Oppenheimer, for example, situates Jackson's fiction within the pressures of post-war conformity, small-town surveillance, and rigid social expectations. As Oppenheimer states, Jackson realized at a very early age that people carried evil inside them. This sparked Jackson's long-time interest in the social performance of normalcy. Noting how her characters often cling to familiar roles, even though those roles become instruments of cruelty and social exclusion. This is particularly relevant to a reading of psychological terror because it underscores how fear arises from instability of the roles meant to guarantee a sense of belonging and not from external threats. As Ruth Franklin posits, Jackson's enduring power lies in her capacity to dramatize scenes of everyday cruelty, revealing how violence can be embedded in politeness and routine. This invites a reflection of Jackson not simply as a mere writer of Gothic unease, but as a sharp critic of social and ethical systems that reward conformity while pushing deviation. Additionally, Nemanja Friedman, in 1979, emphasized Jackson's subversion of domestic ideals. Spaces that are commonly associated to protection and femininity are transformed into sites of vulnerability and coercion. In an equal manner, Dory Lackenhauer, in 2004, argues that Jackson's communities worked as closed systems that keep order through informal but powerful mechanisms of control that include gossip, but also collective silence. Therefore, this comparative aims at examining how psychological terror emerges when characters recognize that the rules that govern belonging are arbitrary and inescapable. This comparative is trying to offer an attempt to examine how psychological terror emerges when characters confront the instability of social meaning. In addition to that, I will try to argue that Jackson constructs terror through moments of recognition. That is, when characters realize that goodness, safety, and belonging um, are not inherent qualities, but privileges granted, monitored, and withdrawn by the community. In Jackson's fiction, fear is not accompanied by the preternatural appearance, but the realization that the ordinary world is ruled by forces that are arbitrary, impersonal, and quietly violent. In the Summer People, fear is grounded in domestic practicality. The Allisons' concerns revolve around basic needs such as food and heat. But these necessities become a source of anxiety as winter approaches after the decision of protracting their stay at the lake. The Allisons then realize that a quiet menace is looming when the local community that welcomes them in summer start having a hostile behavior towards them. The recurrent quote, "Nobody ever stayed at the lake past Labor Day," starts revealing that the Allisons are now considered aliens and are not welcome anymore. Therefore, the ordinary starts becoming threatening. In this short story, terror accrues through repetition rather than through escalation, and the lack of an overt menace intensifies fear since the characters are deprived of a clear object of resistance. Community is a crucial issue in both stories, since it functions as a central mechanism of terror that operates through informal systems of surveillance and judgment. In The Summer People, the Allisons experience a more diffuse form of communal power, and this occurs when the services needed are delayed, help is withheld, and politeness comes to an abrupt end. Their inability to secure belonging in spite of conforming to respectable domestic norms makes terror come to life, and civility fails to protect them, and it reveals itself that the limits of middle class competence is compromised. In The Possibility of Evil, on the other hand, Miss Strangeworth is presented as a model citizen of her town, which respects and admires her in equal measure. This narrative places before the reader's eyes a trustworthy elderly lady delaying moral judgment and intensifying the psychological unease that unfolds along the story. In this case, terror arises from recognition instead of doing it through action. As readers realize that Miss Strangeworth, her sense of moral duty legitimizes cruelty. Miss Strangeworth's authority derives from her position as an elderly and therefore respectable woman whose concern for others seems to be morally justified. Her belief that her actions are motivated to set things right reflects a culturally sanctioned form of feminine moral vigilance in Jackson's stories, and this is what Lenemages Friedman calls evil cloaked in seeming good. Miss Strangeworth's terror is not fear of punishment, but the collapse of her moral image. In fact, she is left isolated as soon as she becomes aware that the town does not recognize her as a good and kind person any longer. Also, in this short story, order, cultivation, and moral superiority are symbolized by Miss Strangeworth's home and garden, symbols that are destroyed together with her identity, this identity that she's trying to maintain. They are not meaningful anymore. The roses that are destroyed at the end, together with the loss of moral ability or moral judgment, is totally crushed. Both stories present psychological terror as a moment of recognition rather than shock. In The Summer People, the Allison's terror stems from the gradual awareness that belonging is conditional and reversible, whereas Miss Strangeworth lies in the sudden and unexpected revocation of moral authority. Since both stories conclude without a resolution, the persistence of fear beyond the text is reinforced. So, this comparative tries to demonstrate that in Shirley Jackson, psychological terror is not produced only by preternatural forces that come and visit us from beyond the grave, but that it can also be produced by the destabilization of everyday social structures. Through understated narration and familiar settings, as well as a gradual erosion of certainty, Shirley Jackson reveals how fear emerges from ordinary life when systems of belonging, moral authority, and domestic security are exposed as fragile and conditional. Thank you very much. These are the references that I have used. So I hope you've liked the presentation. Thank you very much.